My sister blamed me for killing her cat. I proved she was lying. For 3 years, I'd been financially supporting my younger sister, Cassandra. Rent, groceries, emergencies that were never really emergencies. Every month, another crisis. Every month, another chunk of my paycheck gone. She always had an excuse for why she couldn't work. Anxiety, depression, a boss who was mean to her, a commute that was too long. My parents backed her up every single time, calling me selfish whenever I pushed back. Meanwhile, I was eating ramen noodles for breakfast and pulling double shifts just to cover her latest disaster. The final straw was the cat. Cassandra texted me saying her therapist recommended an emotional support animal. An hour later, she sent a link to a $1,000 Russian blue. Before I could even respond, my parents called. It's for her mental health. Don't be so difficult. My hands were shaking from exhaustion, but somehow I found myself at the ATM again. The cat arrived the following week. She named him Mr. Whiskers. For 3 days, everything was quiet. Then came the texts about special food, special litter, vet visits, supplements. The cat apparently needed a $200 monthly budget. Something inside me finally snapped. I blocked her number and texted my parents, "I'm done. She can figure it out herself." 2 days of silence. Then my dad called and his voice was different. Quiet. Serious. "You need to come to Cassandra's apartment. Now." My stomach dropped. I thought she'd hurt herself. I drove there so fast I don't remember the route. When I arrived, the door was open. My whole family was crowded in her living room. Parents, aunts, uncles, even my cousin who never shows up to anything. They all looked at me like I'd committed a crime. Cassandra was sobbing on the couch, mascara running down her face in perfect black streams. "You killed him," she wailed. "You killed Mr. Whiskers." My mom grabbed my arm, nails digging into my skin. "Come see what you did." They dragged me to the balcony. Mr. Whiskers was laid out on a patio chair like he was sleeping peacefully. "You poisoned him," Cassandra shrieked, "because I couldn't afford his food after you abandoned me." Something felt wrong. I reached out and touched the cat. He was frozen. Not just cold. Frozen solid. Stiff as a board. This cat had been dead for at least a week, stored in a freezer. My mind started racing. She'd mentioned getting pet insurance when she first got him. This wasn't about grief. This was about money. It was always about money with her. How could you? My dad's voice cracked with disappointment. "We raised you better than this." My mom was already pulling out her checkbook, offering to cover funeral costs and next month's rent. Everyone was comforting Cassandra while glaring at me. And suddenly everything clicked. The timing, the family gathering, the perfectly preserved body. She'd let this cat die, or it died on its own, and she'd frozen it, waited until I cut her off, and staged this whole scene to frame me and collect insurance money. "You think I poisoned him today?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. "Don't you dare disrespect his memory," my mom snapped. I picked up Mr. Whiskers. He was rigid, like lifting a frozen turkey. Cassandra's eyes went wide with panic. "Put him down! The insurance adjuster needs to see him exactly as—" She caught herself, but it was too late. Everyone heard. "If I killed him this morning," I said, holding up the frozen cat for everyone to see, "then why is his body frozen solid? That's not rigor mortis. That's a freezer. This cat has been dead for at least a week." The room went silent. "She froze him," I continued. "Waited until I stopped sending money, invited you all here, and tried to frame me for killing her cat so she could file an insurance claim and guilt you into covering her rent." I set Mr. Whiskers down gently and looked at my family. My parents, my aunts, everyone who had spent 3 years telling me I was selfish for not giving enough. Cassandra opened her mouth, but for the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. No excuse. No tears that could fix this. "I've been paying her rent for 3 years while eating ramen," I said. "And this is what she does when I finally stop." I walked out without waiting for a response. Got in my car and drove home. My mom called that night crying, saying Cassandra admitted everything. That they were sorry. That they didn't know. I listened. Then I said, "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." I haven't spoken to any of them since. Some people say I should try to repair things. That family is family. But I've learned something important. Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up for you honestly, without schemes or manipulation. For 3 years, I was the only one showing up. Now it's time to show up for myself. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment and everything felt different. My hands were still shaking a little from last night, but it was a different kind of shaking. Not the exhausted trembling from working double shifts, or the stress of wondering what Cassandra needed money for this time. This was more like my body trying to catch up with what my brain already knew. I was done. Actually, done. I got up and went to the kitchen and just stood there looking at my mostly empty cabinets. 3 years of ramen noodles and instant coffee because every extra dollar went to Cassandra's rent, or her groceries, or her latest emergency. I opened the fridge and saw the eggs I'd bought last week, but hadn't cooked because I was too tired. Today I cracked 4 of them into a pan and scrambled them with real butter. The smell filled my tiny kitchen, and I almost cried because it was such a normal thing. Such a simple thing that I'd been denying myself while my sister bought $1,000 cats and special organic food for them. I ate slowly at my little table, and every bite tasted like freedom. My phone started buzzing around 8 in the morning. I picked it up and saw 47 missed calls. Mom, Dad, Cassandra, my aunt, my uncle, even my cousin who I barely talked to. The text messages were worse. Hundreds of them. I scrolled through a few, and they ranged from angry to confused to apologetic. I turned the sound off and put the phone face down on the table. Whatever they wanted to say could wait. I had work, and for the first time in forever, I was actually looking forward to going. I got to the office around 9 and tried to act normal. Checked my emails, made some coffee, started working on the quarterly reports that were due next week. But I kept catching myself just staring at my computer screen, not really seeing anything. My brain kept replaying last night. The frozen cat. Cassandra's face when she realized everyone heard her slip up about the insurance adjuster. The way my whole family just stood there in silence. Duncan came by my desk around 11. He worked in the same department, and we'd always been friendly but not really close. He had this concerned look on his face and asked if I was okay. I must have looked pretty rough. I told him I was fine, but he didn't buy it. He suggested we grab lunch together, and I figured why not. Maybe talking about it would help. We went to the sandwich place down the street and got a booth in the back. Duncan ordered a turkey club, and I got a chicken Caesar wrap. Once we had our food, he looked at me and said I seemed off. I took a deep breath and just started talking. I told him everything. The 3 years of paying Cassandra's rent. The endless emergencies that were never really emergencies. My parents always taking her side and calling me selfish. The expensive cat that I paid for even though I was eating ramen for every meal. The texts demanding money for cat supplies. Me finally snapping and cutting her off. The phone call from my dad. Showing up at her apartment to find my whole family there. The frozen cat on the balcony. Cassandra trying to frame me for poisoning it. Me picking up the cat and realizing it was frozen solid. Her accidentally admitting she was staging it for insurance fraud. The whole thing just poured out of me. And Duncan sat there with his sandwich halfway to his mouth just staring at me. When I finally finished talking, Duncan put his sandwich down and said something I'll never forget. He looked me right in the eyes and said, "She froze a dead cat to frame you." Not as a question, but as a statement, like he was trying to make sense of it in his own head. Then he said it again louder. "She froze a dead cat to frame you." A couple people at nearby tables glanced over, but I didn't care. Duncan kept shaking his head and saying he couldn't believe anyone would do something like that. That it was completely insane. That my family was messed up for not seeing what Cassandra was doing to me all these years. He got genuinely angry on my behalf, and it was such a strange feeling. For 3 years, my family had made me feel like I was the problem. Like I was selfish and heartless for not wanting to support my sister forever. But here was Duncan, who barely knew me, getting mad at them for treating me that way. He said I should have cut Cassandra off years ago. That nobody should have to work double shifts and eat ramen, so their adult sister can live rent-free. That my parents should be ashamed of themselves for enabling her. Every word he said made something click into place in my brain. This wasn't normal. The way my family treated me wasn't normal. Expecting me to fund another adult's entire life wasn't normal. Staging an elaborate fraud scheme when the money stopped wasn't normal. Duncan's reaction showed me that. He was shocked because normal families don't do this stuff. Normal siblings don't freeze dead cats to manipulate their relatives. I'd been living in this situation for so long that I'd started to think maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was being selfish. But Duncan's genuine outrage made me realize how messed up the whole thing really was. That evening, I finally made myself listen to my mom's voicemails. There were 12 of them starting from last night right after I left Cassandra's apartment. The first few were defensive. She said I'd embarrassed the family, that I could have handled it privately instead of making a scene, that Cassandra was fragile and I should have been more sensitive. I almost deleted the rest, but something made me keep listening. Around voicemail number 6, the tone changed. Mom's voice got quieter and she said Cassandra had admitted everything. That the cat had died a week ago and she'd panicked. That she'd kept it in her freezer and waited for the right moment. That she'd planned the whole thing to get insurance money and guilt everyone into covering her rent. Mom said she was sorry. That they didn't know it was this bad. That they should have listened when I tried to tell them how much I was struggling. The later voicemails were all apologies, but they felt hollow. I kept thinking about all the times I'd tried to explain that I couldn't keep doing this. That I was drowning financially. That Cassandra needed to get a job and support herself. Every single time my parents had shut me down, called me selfish, said I didn't understand how hard things were for Cassandra, said family helps family. They'd had 3 years to listen, 3 years to see what was happening, but they didn't want to know. It was easier to make me the bad guy than to deal with Cassandra's manipulation. So no, I didn't feel better after hearing Mom say sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back the $40,000 I'd calculated I'd given Cassandra over 3 years. Sorry doesn't give me back the nights I worked double shifts until I could barely stand. Sorry doesn't erase 3 years of being treated like an ATM instead of a person. My dad called while I was sitting on my couch still processing Mom's voicemails. I almost didn't answer, but I was tired of avoiding everything. I picked up and he started talking immediately. His voice sounded different, thick and heavy like he'd been crying or maybe just felt really guilty. He said he owed me an apology, a real one. He admitted that he and Mom had enabled Cassandra for years because it was easier than making her face reality. Every time she had a crisis, they'd just throw money at it or pressure me to help instead of making her deal with the consequences. He said they'd turned me into Cassandra's personal bank account, and that wasn't fair. That they'd sacrificed my well-being to avoid dealing with her problems. He asked if I would come to dinner this weekend, so we could talk things through as a family. I sat there for a long minute just breathing. Part of me wanted to say yes because they were my parents, and they were finally admitting they'd messed up. But another part of me was just so tired. Tired of being the one who always had to fix things. Tired of being the reasonable one who showed up and tried to make peace. I told Dad I needed time to think about it. That I appreciated the apology, but I wasn't ready to sit down and play happy family after everything that happened. He said he understood, and that whenever I was ready, they'd be there. We hung up, and I felt weird. Not better exactly, but not worse either. Just weird. I spent the next few days thinking about everything and realized I probably needed professional help to sort through it all. 3 years of being treated like a wallet instead of a sister had done more damage than I'd admitted to myself. I found a therapist named Lyra Matsumoto who had good reviews and availability. Her office was in a quiet building downtown with plants in the waiting room and soft music playing. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with short dark hair and a calm way of talking that made me feel less nervous. In our first session, I told her the whole story and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me how it felt to always be the one giving. I said it felt normal because that's what I'd been doing for so long. She wrote something down and then asked if I thought my family saw me as a person or as a resource. That question hit me hard. I'd never thought about it that way, but she was right. To my parents, I was the responsible one who could handle things. To Cassandra, I was a source of money and support. But did any of them actually see me as a person with my own needs and limits? Lyra said something that stuck with me. She said my family had trained me to believe my worth was tied to how much I could give them, that I'd learned to measure my value by how well I could solve their problems and meet their needs. And when I finally set a boundary, they'd treated it like a betrayal, because I wasn't playing my assigned role anymore. We talked for the full hour, and I left feeling like someone had finally put words to everything I'd been feeling but couldn't explain. Cassandra started texting me directly a few days after the frozen cat incident. Long paragraphs about how sorry she was and how she'd made a terrible mistake. But every single apology somehow circled back to her struggles. She was sorry, but she'd been so stressed about money. She was sorry, but her anxiety had been really bad. She was sorry, but she'd felt abandoned when I cut her off. She was sorry, but she didn't know what else to do. I read through the texts and noticed she never actually took responsibility without adding a justification. It was always sorry, but never just sorry. Never I was wrong and there's no excuse for what I did. Always sorry followed by a reason why it wasn't really her fault. I didn't respond to any of them. What was there to say? She'd frozen a dead cat and tried to frame me for killing it so she could commit insurance fraud and manipulate our family into giving her money. No amount of anxiety or stress or feeling abandoned justified that. I'd been stressed and anxious for 3 years while supporting her, and I'd never done anything like this. I just turned off notifications from her number and let the texts pile up unread. Friday came around and Duncan asked if I wanted to hang out with him and some friends that evening. They were going to a bar downtown to watch a game and just relax. My first instinct was to say no because I was tired and didn't really know his friends. But then I realized I'd been saying no to social stuff for years. I was always too broke to go out because my money was going to Cassandra. Or I was too tired from working extra shifts to cover her latest emergency. Or I just felt too guilty spending money on fun when she was texting me about needing help with bills. I'd completely isolated myself without even realizing it. So I told Duncan yes and showed up at the bar around 7. His friends were cool. Normal people who joked around and bought rounds and talked about regular stuff like work and sports and movies. Nobody needed money. Nobody had a crisis. Nobody made me feel guilty for existing. We stayed until almost midnight, and I laughed more in those few hours than I had in months. Going out and having fun without this weight of guilt pressing down on me felt foreign but amazing. Like I was remembering what it was like to be a normal person instead of Cassandra's support system. The next week, my Aunt Raina called me out of nowhere. She was my mom's younger sister, and we'd always gotten along okay but weren't super close. She said she'd heard about what happened with Cassandra and wanted to check on me. I braced myself for another lecture about family sticking together, but that's not what happened. Instead, Raina said she was proud of me for finally setting boundaries. That she'd been worried about this situation for years but felt shut down every time she tried to talk to my parents about it. She said she'd watched me get thinner and more exhausted while Cassandra got more demanding, and my parents just enabled the whole thing. She'd tried to bring it up at family gatherings, but Mom and Dad always changed the subject or got defensive. Raina said what Cassandra did with the cat was horrible, but honestly she wasn't surprised. That Cassandra had been manipulating everyone for years, and it was only a matter of time before she did something really extreme. We talked for over an hour, and it felt good to have someone in the family actually validate what I'd been going through. She told me I didn't owe Cassandra or my parents anything, that taking care of myself wasn't selfish, that I deserved to have my own life instead of funding someone else's. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter, like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this family after all. 2 weeks after the frozen cat incident, I got a call from an insurance investigator, a woman with a professional voice who said she was handling a claim filed by Cassandra Huffman regarding the death of a pet. Cassandra had listed me as the person who allegedly poisoned her cat. The investigator wanted my statement about what happened. I took a deep breath and told her everything. How I'd been supporting Cassandra financially for 3 years. How I'd finally cut her off. How she'd called a family meeting 2 days later and accused me of killing her cat. How the cat was frozen solid when I touched it, proving it had been dead for at least a week. How Cassandra had accidentally admitted she was staging the scene for the insurance adjuster. I gave her the exact timeline showing the cat was already dead before I stopped sending Cassandra money. The investigator asked a few clarifying questions, and I could hear her typing. She said this was clearly a fraudulent claim and thanked me for my cooperation. She mentioned that filing a false insurance claim was a crime and Cassandra could face charges. I hung up feeling weird about it. Part of me felt guilty, like I was getting my sister in trouble. But the bigger part of me remembered that frozen cat and realized Cassandra had done this to herself. I didn't make her commit fraud. I just stopped letting her use me as a personal ATM, and she'd chosen to respond by breaking the law. 3 weeks later, I got the call I'd been half expecting. The insurance investigator told me Cassandra was charged with filing a false claim and attempted insurance fraud. She said the evidence was clear-cut since Cassandra had admitted on recording that she staged the scene for the adjuster. The investigator thanked me again for my statement and said the case was forwarded to the district attorney's office. I hung up and stared at my phone for a minute, trying to process how things had gotten this far. My sister was actually facing criminal charges. Part of me felt vindicated, but a bigger part just felt tired. An hour later, my mom called and I almost didn't answer. When I finally picked up, she was crying, so hard I could barely understand her at first. She kept saying this was going to ruin Cassandra's life, and that she'd have a criminal record, and how could things have gotten so bad? I let her talk for a while, and then I said, Cassandra ruined her own life by committing fraud, that I didn't make her freeze a dead cat and try to frame me for murder, that I didn't make her file a false insurance claim. Mom went quiet and I could hear her breathing on the other end. Then she said in this small voice that I was right, that she'd spent so long making excuses for Cassandra that she'd lost track of who was actually responsible for what. It was the first time in 3 years my mom had admitted I might have a point about anything. We talked for another 20 minutes and she apologized for always taking Cassandra's side and never considering what it was doing to me. I didn't know what to say, so I just told her I needed time to process everything, and we hung up. That night I couldn't sleep, so I logged into my bank account and started scrolling through 3 years of transaction history. Transfer to Cassandra. Transfer to Cassandra. Transfer to Cassandra. Every month, sometimes twice a month. I opened a spreadsheet and started adding it up. Rent payments of $800, grocery money, emergency vet bills for a cat that apparently died weeks before I stopped paying, random requests for $200 here, $300 there. The number kept climbing and climbing until I reached the total, $42,370. I stared at that number on my screen, feeling physically sick. $42,000 that could have been savings or a down payment on a house or actual vacations instead of the 1 weekend trip I'd taken in 3 years. I could have invested it and had it growing. I could have paid off my car. I could have done anything except hand it over to someone who was just going to demand more. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, trying not to cry, because crying felt like admitting how stupid I'd been, how completely I'd let myself be used. The next morning, I had my first appointment with Lyra. Her office was small and comfortable with plants on the windowsill and soft lighting. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started with the frozen cat incident. But then I kept going back further and further until I was explaining the whole 3 years of supporting Cassandra, while my parents called me selfish for not doing enough. Lyra listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me what I was grieving. The question caught me off guard because I hadn't thought about it as grief. But then I started talking about the family I thought I had versus the family I actually had. How I'd believed they loved me, but now I wondered if they'd just seen me as Cassandra's support system. How I'd spent 3 years trying to earn their approval by sacrificing everything, and it had never been enough. And suddenly I was crying harder than I had in years. Not quiet tears, but the kind of sobbing that makes your whole body shake. Lyra handed me tissues and told me it was okay to mourn the loss of the family I'd wanted, even if they were still alive. That realizing your family isn't who you thought they were is a real loss that deserves to be grieved. I left that session feeling raw, but also lighter, like I'd finally admitted something I'd been avoiding. 2 days later, my dad called and asked if I'd be willing to come to family therapy with him and Mom. He said they'd started seeing someone to work on their parenting patterns, and the therapist suggested including me in a session. I almost said no automatically, but something made me pause. I told him I'd come once to see if they were genuinely willing to change, but I wasn't making any promises beyond that. He agreed immediately, and we set it up for the following week. The session was uncomfortable from the start. The therapist was this older woman with sharp eyes who didn't waste time on pleasantries. She asked my parents to explain why they thought I'd agreed to come, and my mom said she hoped we could repair our relationship. The therapist turned to me and asked if that's what I wanted. I said I wanted to see if they were capable of acknowledging how their enabling of Cassandra had hurt me. For the next hour, the therapist walked my parents through their patterns, how they'd sacrificed my well-being to avoid dealing with Cassandra's issues, how they'd made me responsible for my sister's life while calling me selfish for having boundaries, how they'd chosen the path of least resistance even when it meant hurting me. My mom cried through most of it. My dad sat there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. At the end, the therapist asked if they understood why I'd cut contact, and they both said yes. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. A week after that session, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a man's voice asked if I was Cassandra's sister. I said yes, and he introduced himself as her apartment manager. He said Cassandra was 3 months behind on rent, and he'd been trying to reach her with no luck. He asked if I'd be willing to resume making payments since I'd been handling them before. I felt my stomach drop because part of me wanted to just agree to make the problem go away. But I took a breath and told him I wasn't responsible for Cassandra's housing, that she was an adult who needed to handle her own rent. He sounded frustrated and said he'd have to start eviction proceedings then. I said I understood and hung up. For about 10 minutes, I felt guilty, like I was abandoning her all over again. Then I remembered the frozen cat laid out on that patio chair, and the guilt disappeared. Cassandra had tried to frame me for murder to collect insurance money. She could figure out her own rent. Duncan and I had lunch together a few days later, and I found myself actually opening up about everything. Not just the frozen cat story, but the whole 3 years of being used as an ATM. How my parents had enabled it. How I was trying to rebuild my sense of what family meant. Duncan listened, and then he told me about his own brother who'd struggled with addiction, and how the family had eventually had to cut him off. He said it was the hardest thing they'd ever done, but also the most loving, because it forced his brother to face consequences. He said watching someone you love suffer is terrible, but enabling them to destroy themselves is worse. Having someone who understood without judging made me feel less alone in this whole mess. We started meeting up regularly after that, and it felt good to have a friend who got it. My dad called again a few weeks later, and this time his voice was different, heavier. He said he needed to tell me something, and he didn't want me to hear it from anyone else. He admitted that they'd known Cassandra was manipulating me, that they'd watched it happen for 3 years and done nothing because they hoped she'd eventually grow out of it, that they'd thought supporting her was the loving thing to do, even if it meant I was suffering. I was quiet for a long time after he said that. Then I told him that real love would have been making Cassandra face consequences years ago, instead of enabling her to destroy herself and hurt me. That by protecting her from reality, they'd turned her into someone who would freeze a dead cat to commit fraud. My dad was crying by the end of the call. He said he knew I was right, and that he'd failed both of us. It wasn't the conversation I'd wanted, but it was honest in a way our family had never been before. My mom started texting me constantly about 2 months after everything happened. Cassandra had been evicted and moved back in with them. Every text was a complaint about how Cassandra left messes everywhere or stayed up all night or refused to look for work. I mostly ignored them until one day Mom texted asking how I'd dealt with Cassandra's behavior for so long. I responded that I'd set boundaries and expectations, which Mom had always told me was harsh. Then I pointed out that's exactly what they'd expected me to do for 3 years, while living my own life and supporting Cassandra financially. I suggested they try setting some rules for her living there. Mom said that seemed harsh, and I almost laughed. I told her she had 2 choices: set boundaries or let Cassandra walk all over her the way she'd walked all over me. Mom didn't respond for a while after that. I had another session with Lyra where we worked on drafting a letter to my family. She said it was important to clearly outline what I needed for any relationship moving forward. We spent an hour writing and rewriting until I had something that felt right. The letter explained that I needed genuine accountability, not just apologies. That I needed them to respect my boundaries instead of pressuring me to give in. That I needed equal treatment instead of always being expected to sacrifice for Cassandra. I said I was willing to rebuild slowly, but only if they showed consistent change over time. I sent the letter to my parents, and then I waited. I didn't know if they'd actually follow through or if this was just another temporary shift before things went back to normal. 3 weeks after I sent the letter, my mom called with an update. She said they'd sat Cassandra down and told her she needed to get a job and start contributing to household expenses if she wanted to keep living there. Cassandra had thrown a fit and said she couldn't work because of her anxiety and depression. My dad apparently told her that wasn't an excuse anymore, and that she had 2 weeks to find employment, or she'd need to find somewhere else to live. Mom said Cassandra had actually followed through and gotten hired at a retail store in the mall. She complained constantly about how hard it was, and how mean her manager was, and how her feet hurt from standing all day. But she was working for the first time in 3 years. Mom said it quietly, like she couldn't quite believe it herself. I didn't know if it would last, or if this was just Cassandra playing along until she found another angle. But it was something. A small shift in a pattern that had felt unchangeable for so long. A few weeks after Cassandra started working, Mom texted asking if I'd meet her for coffee. Just the 2 of us. No dad, no Cassandra, no extended family members who'd witnessed the frozen cat disaster. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back that I'd think about it. Lyra suggested during our next session that it might be worth hearing what Mom had to say, especially since they'd actually made Cassandra get a job instead of just making excuses. I agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our places on a Saturday morning. Mom was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug like she needed something to hold on to. She looked older than I remembered, more tired. She stood up when she saw me, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she reached out like she wanted to hug me, but wasn't sure if she was allowed. I sat down across from her instead and ordered a coffee from the waiter, who appeared immediately. We sat in silence for what felt like forever, until Mom finally spoke. She started crying before she even got the first sentence out, tears running down her face as she apologized for making me responsible for Cassandra's entire life and happiness. She said she'd been scared of Cassandra's mental health issues and took the easy path of letting me handle everything financially because it was simpler than dealing with the real problems. She admitted they'd known Cassandra was manipulating me but hoped she'd grow out of it eventually. Mom said watching Cassandra actually work and contribute to the household had shown her how much they'd failed both of us by enabling her behavior for years. She kept saying she was sorry over and over while I sat there feeling numb and angry and sad all at once. Part of me wanted to get up and leave, but another part needed to hear this, even if it came years too late. When Mom finally stopped crying enough to talk normally, she told me about how hard it had been having Cassandra back home. The constant complaints about work, the mess everywhere, the expectation that Mom would do everything for her like she was still a child. Mom said she finally understood what I'd been dealing with for 3 years and felt terrible that she'd called me selfish for setting boundaries. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and drank my coffee while she talked. Before we left, Mom asked if we could do this again sometime, and I told her maybe. That I needed to see consistent change over time, not just one emotional conversation. She said she understood, and that she'd keep working on things with Cassandra and Dad. We hugged awkwardly in the parking lot before driving away in separate directions. Raina called me the following week and invited me to dinner at her place. She lived in a small house across town with a garden out front and wind chimes hanging from the porch. When I arrived, she had homemade pasta ready and a bottle of wine open on the counter. We ate together at her kitchen table while she asked about how I was doing after everything that happened. I told her about the coffee with Mom and how strange it felt to have someone from my family actually acknowledge what I'd been through. Raina nodded like she understood completely, and then started telling me stories about setting boundaries with her own siblings years ago. She talked about how her younger brother had expected her to bail him out financially over and over until she finally said no and meant it, how her parents had been upset with her at first, but eventually realized she was right. She said choosing yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is letting other people destroy your life. We talked for hours that night about family dynamics and guilt and learning when to walk away from toxic situations. Raina validated everything I'd been feeling in a way my parents never had. She said she'd watched my family treat me like an ATM for years and wished she'd spoken up sooner, but my parents had shut her down whenever she tried. Before I left, she said we should make this a regular thing if I wanted, that she'd be happy to be the family connection I actually chose to maintain instead of feeling obligated to. I agreed immediately, and we started having dinner together every couple of weeks after that. Sometimes we cooked, sometimes we ordered takeout, but we always talked honestly about life and family and boundaries. It became something I looked forward to instead of dreaded like most family obligations had been. 3 months after the frozen cat incident, my boss called me into his office on a random Tuesday afternoon. I thought I was in trouble for something, but instead he told me they were promoting me to senior analyst with a significant raise. The extra money meant I'd be making almost $15,000 more per year. When I got back to my desk, I just sat there staring at my computer screen trying to process what had happened. For the first time in years, the extra money would go into my savings account, instead of disappearing into Cassandra's latest manufactured crisis. I could actually build an emergency fund, take a vacation, maybe even start investing for my future. Duncan came over when he noticed I looked shocked and I told him about the promotion. He gave me a high five and suggested we celebrate after work. That night, a group of us went out for drinks and I paid for my own tab without worrying about whether I'd have enough left over for groceries. It felt incredible to spend money on myself without guilt eating away at me. I opened a new savings account the next day and set up automatic transfers from each paycheck. Watching the balance grow week after week gave me a sense of security I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't eating ramen for breakfast anymore. I wasn't pulling double shifts to cover someone else's rent. I was finally building something for myself instead of watching my paycheck disappear into someone else's bottomless pit of needs. I'm building a life that's actually mine now. Real friendships with people like Duncan and Raina who show up for me without expecting me to fund their existence. A savings account that grows instead of staying permanently empty. Therapy sessions where I'm learning that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about who shows up for you honestly without schemes or manipulation. My relationship with my parents is cautious but slowly improving as they actually work on their enabling patterns instead of just talking about change. Mom and I have coffee every few weeks, and she's stopped making excuses for Cassandra's behavior. Dad called last month to apologize again and actually listened when I explained how much damage their enabling had caused. Cassandra is still working at the retail store and apparently complaining less about it. I don't know if she's genuinely changing or just biding her time until she finds another angle, but that's not my problem anymore. I'm finally showing up for myself the way I showed up for everyone else for so long, putting my own needs first without guilt, setting boundaries without apologizing, building a future that belongs to me instead of sacrificing everything for someone who would freeze a dead cat to manipulate me. Life isn't perfect, but it's genuinely mine now, and that feels incredible.